Welcome to Patty's Aquatics. So in today's video, what I want to do is talk about dirted tanks. Now, within the last few years, dirted tanks have really rose in popularity within the hobby. So I really want to pose the question, are dirted tanks worth it? So I'd like to go over each component within a dirted tank and really figure out, are they worth your time? Are they worth your money? Are the benefits from dirted tanks, do they outweigh like a sand substrate or a gravel substrate? So those are the questions I want to ask. This will be a pros and cons type video. So let's take a look into the good, the bad, and the dirty of dirted tanks. So stay tuned. So today, like I said, I'm going to talk about each component within a dirted tank and kind of give you the good, the bad, and the dirty. The good and the bad really of each component in my own experiences. I keep an entire fish room full of dirted tanks, and everything I'll talk about is from my own experiences within this hobby, keeping them myself. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that each component within a dirted tank, like your substrate, your live plants, if you have hardscape, the water and the inhabitants, they're all important cogs to that ecosystem within your aquarium. And each one depends on each other to survive and to keep this ecosystem going. It's a cycle and they each rely on each other. Now, I used the analogy once in a live stream that basically think of it as a chair. Each component to these aquariums are a leg to a chair holding up that ecosystem. Now, if you take out one of those legs, a chair is going to fall. It's the same thing with these aquariums. If you take out one of those components, your ecosystem is going to have issues. It's going to be unbalanced and you can have issues. So it's very important to make sure you maintain an entire ecosystem, a balanced ecosystem with these aquariums to thrive. Now, with that being said, let's start with one of the first components and one of the most important ones, and that's your substrate. So the substrate, like I said, is probably the most important part of it. That's why we call it a dirted tank. And let's start with the dirt. It can be very cost effective. It really depends on how you want to do it. You could go as far as just grabbing a shovel of dirt from your backyard if you wanted to. You could buy a bag of organic potting soil or whichever you'd like from a local hardware store. I get mine for about $2 to $3 for a bag, which is enough for many tanks to use. You could order it from Father Fish and get the dirt and the supplements. It really depends on how you want to do it. I know aqua soils can be a little bit more expensive. But dirt-wise, I mean, like I said, cost effectiveness is a very big plus when it comes to these style of tanks. Now, with cap, most people use sand or gravel. I've used both before, and I can say that sand is by far my favorite. Now, the reason being is with sand, your organic matter, your waste, fish waste, all that has time to break down on the surface of the sand. It breaks down and then it slowly feeds through that sand down into your soil layer in order to feed it. Now with gravel, what happens is you have all those pockets, porous pockets within your substrate with the gravel, and the waste and organic matter, all that breaks down and it just sits in those pockets and it doesn't really break down as well. And because of that, when you have something that sits around organic matter and waste, it eventually turns to dirt. And that was my issue with gravel. I would have many pockets of like dirt forming throughout that cap on my substrate. And I didn't really like that at all, where that does not happen with sand. So in my opinion, sand is much more superior over gravel when it comes to a cap. One of the biggest benefits of having a dirted tank is that substrate and the deep substrate itself and what it does for your aquarium. Now, by having it so thick, what happens is it cuts off oxygen to that bottom layer of the substrate, typically the dirt layer, and it creates an anaerobic environment. And what that does is it creates a denitrifying bacteria. And that denitrifying bacteria, if you understand by the name of it, denitrifying, it gets rid of all the nitrates and ammonia and nitrites within your aquarium. All my aquariums, I do not register maybe even 5 parts per million nitrate ever. Sometimes I don't register anything and they've been up for years. So it eats that nitrates out of the water. And that's a huge benefit because that really cuts down on the maintenance that you need to do within your aquariums. So now that we talked about the substrate, let's move on to the plants, and I'm talking live plants because they are crucial to this style of tank. Now, live plants, what they do, obviously, as we all know, is they pull nutrients out of the water column, but they also help filter the water and create oxygen. Now, I don't keep filters or have air pumped into any of my aquariums, so plants are crucial for me. They are my filters. They are the water clarifiers. They pull anything out of the water that's in the water column, like I said, so it's very important. Now, in the beginning of dirty tanks, it's very crucial to have lots and lots of stem plants. Now, the reason being is, like I said, stem plants grow so fast and they are very good at pulling mass amounts of nutrients out of the water column, like I mentioned a few times already. And that's because in the very beginning, your water can have a little bit of leaching of ammonia and high nutrient levels from that dirt. So it's very important to put a mass amounts of stem plants within those aquariums in the very setup. Otherwise, you could battle algae issues. And I've had that mistake myself. There's a few tanks where I just didn't have a lot of plants on hand. I didn't put a lot of stem plants in there, and I battled the algae for a while. For other ones, like I have an Oscar tank over there, I threw lots and lots of stem plants in and I never dealt with algae once. So like I said, it's very crucial and important to make sure you put lots of stem plants in there in the beginning. Now, you can add like your swords or your crypts and stuff like that, but I would make sure you put enough stem plants first. You could always have it grow up, and then after it settles and balances, remove some of those stem plants and put more of your bigger plants in there if that's something that interests you. But just keep in mind, like I said, stem plants are important, especially in the beginning. Now, the other thing with plants are, with dirty tanks, which is a negative, is when you want to pull them up, you're going to have those roots that are into the dirt. It's going to pull up and release dirt into the water column, and it makes a mess. So that is a big negative when it comes to these style of tanks. So keep that in mind if you want to move plants around. What I do personally when I do pull plants out of a dirty tank and I know they're rooted deep into the dirt, is I just slowly kind of just twirl them out and slowly do it. And it kind of, with the sand cap, the sand kind of collapses back down into that hole as I do it, and I get minimal dirt into the water column. Now, I've had it before where I pulled an entire sword plant out of there and it went black. So the water went black from the dirt. So just keep that in mind, that moving plants around definitely is a negative when it comes to this style of tank. You know, also with these plants, I don't use any fertilizer anymore. Before these dirty tanks, I was diligent on fertilizing my tanks every week. Since I put dirty tanks in my fish room down here, I don't use fertilizer anymore at all. You know, and the strange part, like I said, I don't register nitrates barely in any of my aquariums, but still my plants grow and thrive even without fertilizer. It's all the nutrients from that soil layer. They're really just pumping these plants up with nutrients from the roots up. So like I said, fertilizers are no longer needed in this style of tank as well, which is a huge plus. Another plus with the plants is the plant growth. It is just insane. My Oscar tank, like I mentioned before, the plants have grown so tall. It's a 65 gallon. It's a taller tank. They're almost all to the surface already. This tank here, I just set this one up not even a month ago, and the plants are already reaching the surface of the water. So plant growth is amazing. Like I said earlier, the plants just grow so much from all the nutrients that are at that root level. So that's another big plus with this style of tank. Now, those are a few things about the plants, but let's move on to the water itself. Now, I mentioned that the plants pull a lot of nutrients out of that water column in the beginning. And one thing that I did notice in a lot of my tanks is after I initially set up these dirty tanks, after anywhere from a few weeks to a month or so, a lot of times I would wind up getting cloudy water. Now, I don't run filtration like I mentioned before, so I don't know if that has something to do with it, but I usually battle it. Sometimes they last only a few days. Sometimes it's a couple weeks. I've had some that lasted like well over a month, but then it goes away. It's sort of like I said earlier, each component is relying on each other and they need to balance out. Once they balance out and that chair gets balanced, you know, one leg's not longer than the other. Once they get all the same and that chair sits evenly, that ecosystem is balanced and sitting evenly, that water kind of, it clears out and it gets crystal clear, and then I don't have issues typically again. So the next thing let's talk about are the inhabitants within one of these aquariums. Now, you can pretty much keep any type of fish in there for the most part. Now, I challenge that a little bit. I have an Oscar and a Pahaka puffer in each in their own dirty tanks. And, you know, everything I've read with, especially with the Oscars, is like you can't keep them in dirty tanks. They're gonna dig in the substrate, they're gonna rip up the plants, and yada yada yada. Well, all that may be true, but I challenge that by putting a baby Oscar in my aquarium. Now in the substrate, I put egg crate above the dirt and underneath the cap, so that if it would dig, it's never going to reach that dirt layer. Now, as far as the plants, yes, he still might be able to pull those plants out eventually as he gets bigger. He's about, I don't know, 4 months old now, 3 months, something like that. He's probably about like 6 inches long, and he loves the plants as of now. He likes to hide and back in them, and we'll see what happens. But like I said, just about any type of fish can be worked and possible in one of these style of tanks if you do some due diligence and research, maybe figure out ways how to stop them, like my Fahaka puffer. They usually like to dig in the substrate. Mine really doesn't. Mine buries itself about halfway. So what I did is I made a thicker cap. I put about 4 inches of cap in that tank so that if he would dig, he wouldn't reach that dirt layer. So there's ways around things, and just always keep that in mind that, you know, it's very crucial to think outside the box. I know that's part of a slogan within my channel, but it truly does apply to this hobby, is really thinking outside the box. Just because something says you can't do something doesn't mean you can't figure out a way to make it work. So inhabitants are a big part of it, like I said, and challenge yourself. So I really find these dirty tanks to be one of the coolest type of tanks and beneficial types of tanks that we have in this hobby. Now, I wouldn't have an entire fish room of them if I didn't love them. But that being said, they're not for everybody, and I get that. But if you are going to attempt one of these aquariums, just keep in mind that you really need to have things balance out. Like I mentioned earlier, you might have algae issues. You might get some cloudy water for a while. I mean, it happens. It's all part of the cog of these style of tanks, because you need balance. Balance is the most important thing I can tell you when it comes to these aquariums. That once in a while, when things aren't balanced, you will have issues, but it will balance out eventually. And a lot of times you just let it. You just let it, and you don't do anything, and let nature take over, and it balances itself, and you will have a pristine, clear water tank with so many live, vibrant plants that you don't know what to do with. I trim my plants in my aquariums here like almost every week because they grow so much, and it's a cool thing. It's a cool experience to try, and I highly recommend it. For the few negatives that there are, in my opinion, there are a lot more positives to it. That's the greatest thing about this hobby, is really trying different things. I love to try different things, because how else are you going to figure out what you like and what you don't? And that's a big plus of it. So keep that in mind. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please think about subscribing to my channel if you're not already. I also offer memberships if you're interested. So hit that join button if you want. And always remember to think outside the box, take a step back into nature, and I hope to see you next time here at Patty's Aquatics.